Alrighty, excellent. Yep, thank you again for coming today and joining us at our train trek Walla meeting today, Sunday, August 15th. I am Patrick Carnahan, and along with my colleague here, Charlie Hamilton, we are the co-executive director team at All Aboard Washington. With us today, as well as our president, Kathy Davis. And we're really glad to be here on the train track. This is a big event that we're doing all across the Pacific Northwest region. And we have a number of very generous sponsors who are contributing to our effort, including a number of individuals and members, a couple of representatives who have joined us along and who have been very communicative about passenger rail projects. So we're very appreciative of everybody who is supporting us on this this pretty big event that we've got going on here. The 2021 train trek is taking place across a number of different destinations. We started off in the Puget Sound region on Thursday, made our way throughout the sort of the Wenatchee Valley area on Friday. Spent a lot of yesterday in the Yakima Valley, and today we are here in the southeast corner of Washington, visiting Walla, and later on this afternoon we will be going to Lewiston, Idaho. From there, we will continue on Monday to go to Big Sky, Montana, where the Pacific Northwest Economic Region will be holding its annual summit at the Big Sky Resort. I will be giving a presentation talking a little bit about All Aboard Washington's efforts to restore passenger rail service, and I will be joined by a number of amazing colleagues from across the region who are doing similar work, including County Commissioner of Missoula County, David Strohmeyer, who was instrumental in funding the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, who was a generous sponsor for our event, as well as colleagues in Idaho and Oregon. So it's really going to be an interesting event. We're going to be talking about passenger rail, and I think a way that many of these representatives will only be hearing about for the first time. So we're really excited about that. And from there, we will continue on to Spokane, Cheney, Ritzville, Ellensburg, and then finally wrap it up in Cle Elum with our annual picnic and a board meeting. So who is All Aboard Washington? We've been around for a while. For over 40 years, we've been the primary champion in Washington State for better passenger rail services, as well as freight rail services. We are a nonprofit group consisting of individuals, businesses, and a coalition of other goal-oriented groups who really want to make transportation better across the Northwest. And while historically we've been strongly focused on rail, given its lack of given the lack of champions, kind of for rail, we are making sure we work closely with other groups, and this is particularly important in this corner of the state. We recognize that rail isn't the only way that you can improve mobility across the region. We recognize that there's an important role that connecting bus service plays. We recognize that there's an important role for cycling and for walking, for local transit. There's a lot of connections here that make it possible for you to go from wherever you're living, out your front door to wherever it is in the entire Pacific Northwest region that you want to go. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about here today. First of all, we'll connect our 3 E's to our 3 guiding principles, what we call the 3 E's, to transportation as a whole. Then we'll kind of bring in some of our current efforts, particularly the restoration of east-west passenger rail service across Stampede Pass, serving Seattle and Spokane. And we can probably talk a little bit as well about our sister organizations' work to restore passenger rail between Portland and Boise. And then finally, how can you help? How can you as citizens, representatives, wherever you might be, if this is something you're interested in, we want to show you how you can help and you can contribute toward these efforts to improve transportation services across the Pacific Northwest. So as we're getting into this, it's good to kind of frame ourselves and to frame our conversation around what is world-class transportation. When you talk with people about it, you might think it's down to having a really good streetcar network. Maybe it's down to maybe it's that fancy new light rail system that's being built in Seattle. Maybe it's the bullet train like you have in Japan. Perhaps it's that, that futuristic new Hyperloop system that a lot of people are raving about. A lot of times it gets down to some sort of rail. Rail is almost always kind of in people's vision for what world-class transportation is. But we at All Aboard Washington recognize that it's a lot more than just trains. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to study abroad in Japan and live abroad in Naples, Italy for quite a while. And in all those experiences, it wasn't just the quality of the train system that made the difference. It was how easy was it to walk to and from stations? How possible was it for me to ride my bike to the station and park there? Like in Japan, for example, you'll find like bike parking lots or bike parking garages, like you can see they're kind of in the middle. Are there bridges that cross over roads to make it safer for people to cross? Is there good local bus service? Is there good intercity connecting bus service with rail? All those things really helped make it easy to go wherever I wanted to go. So when we're talking about transportation, we need to be thinking in that broader mindset. What it really boils down to, if you want to keep it as simple as possible, is it reasonably easy to get from here to there? Can I walk out my front door and go wherever I want and not have to go through way too many hoops, spend way too much money, go through a whole bunch of hassle in order to get where I want to go? That's what it's really down to. And unfortunately, we know here in the Pacific Northwest, especially outside of the big cities, it really isn't that easy. Charlie and I did a couple searches with some mapping programs. On the left is an Apple Maps route from Seattle to Cle Elum, which is right down the I-90 corridor. Shouldn't be that hard, right? Wrong. It took, the routing that was suggested was from Seattle to Wenatchee, and then spend the night in Wenatchee, and then take a bus the next morning to get to Ellensburg, wait a couple more hours in Ellensburg, and then finally make our way to Cle Elum. And that suggested trip was 19 hours and 49 minutes by the existing options, right? And that's less than a 2-hour drive away by freeway under normal conditions. Similarly, I did a route from Spokane to Walla Walla, just trying to see how that was. It suggested going down to Hermiston, literally leave the state, then grab another bus to Pendleton, then grab a bus from Pendleton to Walla Walla. You can't even stay within the same state, to get to where you want to go in this case. And the suggested travel time was 7.5 hours, when normally it would be closer to 3 hours, certainly less than 4 hours under normal driving conditions. So we know that it's a struggle. And in Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon, we recognize that traveling as a reality means that you've either got to own a car, and you have to be able to afford to own a car. You have to, buy the car, maintain the car, insure the car, keep up with your driver's license, can't make any mistakes with that, or else, you lose your license. And then you deal, if it's the winter, get on your knees, put on your chains. If it's the summer, get ready to deal with ridiculous traffic and horrible construction. And if you want to try an alternative, maybe there's a bus, maybe not. If you're lucky enough to live close to a community with air service, well, then you've got to shell out tons of money. I did a routing, you can see kind of in the picture on the left, it's a little hard to read, but I was looking at what it would cost to go from Yakima to Seattle. And that just, kind of I need to do this within the next couple of days. That was going to be almost $240 via Alaska Airlines. And I would have to, from Yakima to Spokane, and that suggested going via Seattle. And that was going to take a few hours and be just about as long as driving. And yet I have to shell out $200 for it. So doesn't that make you look forward to your next trip? We recognize that there are multiple transportation issues in Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon that make it really hard to get around. There used to be a service connecting Eastern Washington and the Yakima and Kittitas Valleys with Seattle, but that was discontinued in 1981. There is still a little bit of service kind of, not too far away, but it only operates once a day and it's in the middle of the night. So it's tremendously inconvenient for most people, and you still have to drive there, or you still have to take a bus connection there that may or may not work out, or may not even exist. We know that Greyhound bus service has declined across the Northwest. Greyhound subsidiary Bolt Bus, which operated a lot along the I-5 corridor, has shut down. Greyhound has cut a lot of their services across Canada, and their network in Central and Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon have been cut significantly. A lot of those routes are now down to, maybe once a day at best, perhaps less. SeaTac charter buses, if you're close enough to be, near SeaTac, are expensive, but of course they don't go quite this far, so you don't have that as an option. Air service, as we know, whether you're flying out of Pendleton or whether you're flying out of Yakima, is very expensive and may not be very well available. And then finally, we all know how fun it is driving those freeways. Any time of year, the windshield time, can certainly mess you up. Going in the winter means you have to deal with passes a lot of the times. Going in the summer means you have to deal with construction. And there can be closures of any of those passes at any time of the year, which cuts you off from, big parts of your state and the region. It's a really serious issue. And unfortunately, the pandemic made things worse. During the pandemic, Amtrak service across the entire Northwest was cut significantly. The Amtrak Cascade service serving the corridor between Eugene, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, BC was cut significantly. All service north of Seattle to Northwest Washington and Vancouver, BC was cut, understandably with the border situation. And service between Seattle, Portland, and Eugene was cut down to a single train a day. Additionally, the Coast Starlight, which serves much of the corridor south of Portland, was cut down to less than daily, only 3 times a week. And the Empire Builder, which goes between Portland and Spokane and Seattle and Spokane, was cut down also to 3 times a week. Thankfully, things are looking up. All of the long distance routes have been restored to full service. So now Oregon long distance service is back up to snuff. Washington long distance service is back to daily. We're still missing a few trips in the Cascades corridor between Seattle and Portland, but pretty much most of the service in Oregon is up to snuff, and it's really only the service north of Seattle that is having issues that hasn't been restored yet, meaning that Whatcom County and Skagit County don't have service. And ridership has returned as well, even before the Amtrak Cascades trains were returned to more round trips, even with just 1 train a day. A lot of those trains were selling out or approaching selling out. They were performing just as well as before the pandemic in terms of the load factors. So thankfully, people are getting back on the rails, and we know from some of Amtrak's own data that a lot of the long distance and rural services were the ones that held up the best. They maintained the highest percentage of the ridership and saw some of the fastest recovery in the entire country. So linking this into to what we call our 3 E's, our 3 guiding principles. How do we believe that better passenger train Well, 3 guiding principles are economic development, environmental stewardship, and we understand the harder to travel, the less likely it is that people will want to travel or will be able to travel or will choose to travel. From Amtrak's own data, we understand that about 11% of ridership in the state of Washington is actually consisting of people who would not have chosen to travel had the train not been available to them. This is above the national average. The national average is about 8%. Here in Washington state, it's about 11%. And that's including both urban routes and rural routes, both the Amtrak Cascades and the Empire Builder and Coast Starlight, which serve a number of communities across the state, both urban, rural, small town, medium town, everything. And we know that travel is quite valuable. When people choose to visit towns, and particularly small towns, they leave a big impact. According to Experience Washington, the Washington State Tourism Bureau, the average day trip visitor spends about $84 in the communities that they visit, and the average overnight visitor spends $366. Based on our analysis of the proposed restoration of east-west service between Seattle and Spokane via the Yakima Valley, that would add up to about $7 million across the state of people who simply wouldn't have chosen to travel. And we know that a lot of that impact is going to be in small communities where it makes an enormous difference. Additionally, when it comes to equity and accessibility, this is a point that kind of connects in both with economics and with accessibility and equity. there's an interesting example of Virginia, who conducted a study a while ago about what it would cost to expand service or to expand the lane capacity on I-95 between Washington, D.C. and Fredericksburg, Virginia. And they found that it was going to cost $12.5 billion to build, 50 miles worth of highway lanes. But they went one step further, unlike a lot of other state DOTs, and they asked, what else could we do with this money? What if we invested it into our rail network, which we know covers the entire state, and we decided to make improvements, expand service, and create a statewide network? And they found that for $12.5 billion, they could buy a lot of the tracks from the freight railroads. They could refurbish a lot of the existing rail infrastructure that the freight railroads don't have the incentives to fix up to higher speed standards. And they could run passenger service from corner to corner, east to west, north to south. They can improve commuter service. They can improve intercity service. They can make improvements for the Amtrak long distance trains for the same money as 50 miles worth of lane expansion, which after 10 years of construction would fill up and be going exactly the same speed as it was, 10 years earlier. And that makes a big impact. The Virginia found out that for that sum of money, they could expand the service across the state, including in rural areas. Fun fact, people in Washington state don't just live in Seattle. People in Oregon don't just live in Portland. There are lots of people outside of the major metropolitan areas that benefit from transit services. We know urban communities are not the only ones that benefit from services, particularly something as simple as just a few trains a day or a few buses a day, something that we don't even have now. So this is a serious equity issue that we think Virginia has solved in terms of its economics and in terms of statewide connectivity. We are encouraging the state of Washington and our counterparts, AORTA, the Association of Oregon Rail and Transit Advocates down in Oregon, are encouraging our states to think more broadly. We want to have a connection between local public transit, sidewalks, bike lanes, and intercity rail and bus services that we know provide connections that make it possible to go to anywhere from anywhere. One thing that's also encouraging news that we've been kind of staying up with is that in the federal government, there's been a historical bias toward projects that save travel time. And the way that travel time savings is measured is, with the consultants, is exactly this sort of thing of widening lanes. Okay, by improving the number of cars that go through per hour, technically you save time, even though everyone still stays stuck in traffic, and traffic gets a lot worse typically, as freeways get expanded. But in the current administration, there's a lot of interest in changing around the weight of equity and of travel time saved. So now the US DOT is being a lot more considerate of whether or not a project improves safety, whether or not it improves equity, whether or not it improves interconnectivity, accessibility, those sorts of things. So that's something that is going to be a really exciting potential for both east-west service within Washington and east-west service within Oregon. And a critical point to mention, because there's historically been some fighting between, do we do more bus service? Do we do more train service? It shouldn't be about fighting about is it bus or train. It shouldn't be fighting about mode. It should be fighting about how do we create a more connected system. Two states stand out in this regard. California has an amazing Amtrak throughway bus system. Hold on, let me make sure that didn't mess up. There we go. There we are, okay, because it was just unplugged for a second. The states of California and North Carolina do an excellent example. They do an excellent job of creating connecting bus services with rail. I listened into a conversation in California, that's something called Corridor Conversations, where they got representatives from Amtrak's 3 major intercity rail corridors to participate in kind of a panel discussion and to kind of showcase their services. And a really interesting point about the San Joaquin service, which connects the San Francisco Bay Area and Sacramento to the Central Valley, was that they spend about 25% of their budget on their Amtrak through California throughway service, but 57% of San Joaquin's riders use the bus on at least one end of the trip. So that really makes an enormous difference in terms of improving the connectivity system. And there's a similar story with North Carolina, whereby even though North Carolina does have a lot of older rail infrastructure, they haven't come up with those agreements yet. However, given the state's investment in the Piedmont corridor between Charlotte and Raleigh-Durham, they have also connected those services with a lot of buses that go out to the coast and make it a lot easier for people to get around. And they also will start bus services to places that they eventually want to develop into rail corridors, to get people interested, to make the possibilities there for people to travel and to get more information about it. So that way they can make informed decisions about which routes to expand and when. So we understand that this is going to be a critically important about service expansion in the Pacific Northwest as well. And then finally, environment. We know, based on the information that we have less than 10 years to cut emissions by 45% of 2010 levels. We don't have a lot of time to keep kicking the can. There've been a lot of transportation and infrastructure and urbanism issues that have been put off for far too long. We haven't been putting in the money. We haven't been giving the weight toward local public and that's exactly what's kept people in cars. That's what has made us so dependent on our highway system. And we need to take prudent action. And the top priority is that we need to figure out how to provide alternatives to driving and alternatives to freight trucking. 29% of our emissions as a country, according to the EPA from, I believe, 2018 or 2019, 29% of our emissions come from the transportation sector. And of that, 82% are related to road. That includes heavy duty semi trucks as well as personal passenger vehicles. So it's really about finding solutions that make it possible for people to get out of their cars and for freight to be moved by rail, which is a significantly less carbon intensive way of moving things around. It's also less space intensive, doesn't consume as much land, meaning we can devote more land toward agriculture, or we can preserve more land without having it be developed. So our vision, if we can summarize it in a single sentence, is we believe with prudent short-term investments, particularly in rail and local transit services, we believe Washington State can revive its rail revolution, which started 30 years ago with a plan for high-speed rail and all sorts of other connection improvements across the Northwest. And we can get back on track toward creating a truly world-class transportation network, not just a good rail network, not just a good bus network, not just a good ferry network, but a truly world-class transportation network, a transportation system that serves all on both sides of the mountains, north, south, east, west, urban, rural, no matter where you're at. And this is something we published in Speedlines. I wrote an article kind of detailing our vision and challenging the Pacific Northwest High-Speed Rail Project to be more inclusive of Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon communities, because as the project stands right now, it doesn't seem to be including much of anything for the eastern halves of our states. So this is our vision map for how we believe that we can improve our services to at least come up with a very good baseline for what is necessary, based on projects that are on the books, as well as ones that we think, at least in the short term, would provide a lot of significant improvements across the region. First of all, starting daytime east-west passenger rail service across Stampede Pass and improving the connecting bus services to communities like Walla Walla and Lewiston, Idaho. We believe that if we get the east-west line started and we extend the existing connecting bus service that goes from the Tri-Cities to Walla Walla and go beyond Walla Walla to Dayton and Lewiston, that service will create a grid that makes it possible for people in this entire corner of the state to get anywhere in the state. And similarly, people who want to travel to Walla Walla or Lewiston would have a better connection. Similarly with Pendleton, I know that bus exists here in Pendleton. So that creates an extra step, that takes away some of the steps that would be needed for people to get to Pendleton, not doing as many bus connections. That, along with improving the existing Amtrak Cascade service, improving connections to local transit, and adding in stations where none exist right now, such as Blaine, Washington, and such as several places between the Tri-Cities and Spokane, like Connell, Ritzville, and Cheney. So today we'll be focusing mostly on improving east-west service across Stampede Pass and what that means for Southeast Washington. in particular relating that connecting bus service to it, how we think this project is going to benefit Walla Walla, and talking about some of the ideas that are out there for what this could do. East West has been around for a long time. The 1992 high-speed rail plan that was created by Washington State DOT included routes not just along the I-5 corridor as originally envisioned, but it also featured an east-west high-speed rail line. And one of the first steps that came about with that after the establishment of Amtrak Cascade service was an initial look into the reestablishment of passenger rail service across Stampede Pass. In June of 2001, WashDOT published a feasibility study doing a base level analysis of the service to answer the question, is it possible? Is it feasible? Is it something that is, is it something that's possible to do? And according to the study, it is in fact physically and operationally feasible to start using train service across Stampede Pass again. They found that while travel times would be slow, it would connect regions of the state that do not have a lot of existing service right now, and it would significantly improve connections across the entire region. But unfortunately, due to some circumstances that happened around that time, such as the passing of a car tab reduction fee, WashDOT ended up losing a lot of funding support, particularly for multimodal transportation. And after that, that was exactly what contributed to things like Washington State's ferry maintenance backlog, as well as a lot of slowing down of the Amtrak Cascades program. And unfortunately, after this 2001 study for East West, there wasn't a lot more looking into that. WashDOT just lost a lot of the resources it needed to do that. All Aboard Washington continued to push for that. There were a lot of letters of support that we got and that we showed to WashDOT and to the legislature, but given the circumstances, it took another 15 years or so before we were able to get back on our feet and continue working on this. In 2017, All Aboard Washington helped sponsor a ridership assessment study with Central Washington University. And Professor John Bowen and his students reached out to people all across the Yakima and Kittitas valleys. And they got a lot of really great information about whether people, what sort of interest people had in the service. And what they found was that while most people I talked with were completely unaware of the project's existence, when they heard about it, they absolutely loved it. And they absolutely wanted to see it happen. And they provided kind of this little map in there about what sort of places would we go. And really it was across the entire region, across the state of Washington and beyond. So it showed the possibilities for restarting the service, that it would be something not just serving Washington, but really the entire Northwest region. So we took this to the legislature over the course of the next couple of years. And in 2019, we succeeded in convincing the legislature to fund the next level of study that was necessary to make the East-West service a reality, a second level feasibility study, which would examine more information such as the ridership, more specific infrastructure costs that would be needed, and some of the more specific challenges that the service would face that would need to be overcome in order for the service to be started. And the key findings were that really they found tremendous community support as well. According to their own surveys of community residents and stakeholders, they found that there was a 77% support rating of people who were either partially or strongly in favor of the project. They found that ridership would be comparable, if not better, than a lot of other Amtrak state-supported corridors. For example, the Piedmont in North Carolina. They found that with twice-a-day ridership between Seattle and Spokane, despite taking almost 8.5 hours to get from end to end and serving a much more rural corridor than what the Piedmont does, just 2 trains a day versus the 3 of the Piedmont would serve about the same number of people. So which is pretty tremendous, despite the challenges of that. And we found that for less than $500 million, that is less than 4 Olympic class ferries that the state of Washington is purchasing for the West Side, we could build a passenger rail service corridor serving Seattle, Spokane, and the Yakima and Kittitas valleys and the Tri-Cities. And it would cover the whole state with annual operations costs of less than $30 million, $30 million. But the STEER study did have a few negative points. However, we noticed a few weird things that were being considered. The ridership graph I showed before, talking about the diverted ridership, 11% of riders who wouldn't ride the train, is information from Amtrak regarding their information on people who travel within the state of Washington. And according to that, only 47% of rail passengers in the state, both on their urban routes and their rural routes, actually would drive as an alternative. Yet STEER only measured diversion from people who would drive. That means that you've left out the 53% of people who would either fly, ride the bus, or not travel at all. That means you're completely leaving out the 20% of Washingtonians who don't have a driver's license. That means that you're missing out on a lot of potential ridership. And we think that it's possible, if you kind of extrapolate that STEER may have underestimated ridership by as much as half. Additionally, there was a big deal made about the long journey times. This is because of the federal emphasis on travel time saved, that they, according to their models, probably the same models used to justify adding an extra lane onto I-90 or I-84, that there wouldn't be a lot of people who would ride, that would make it a serious impact. But the point of this is not to create the fastest way to get from east to west, the fastest way to get from Seattle to Spokane. The point is to provide an option that does not exist yet, a public service that is significantly better than any of the existing services that exist right now. It's making for seamless transportation across the entire state and not just in the urbanized I-5 corridor. And what's also interesting is that the slowest part of the route is between Auburn and Cle Elum over the mountains. But on the whole, between Cle Elum and the Tri-Cities, and between the Tri-Cities and Spokane, the service is actually pretty time competitive with driving and other transportation modes. So on the whole, for the people who would benefit from it the most, it would actually be a pretty useful and time competitive service that would serve as an excellent alternative for people traveling throughout central and eastern Washington. Additionally, there were some comments in there about infrastructure costs where they seem to have forgotten that Ellensburg and Toppenish have stations that could be reused. All you would need to do is the platforms. You wouldn't necessarily need to rebuild the entire station, as was suggested. They also suggested that they would need to front the costs for 8-car train platforms, but that wouldn't be completely necessary. They were also considering either running shorter trains or they forgot to consider that those platforms are owned and operated by Sound Transit, and therefore Sound Transit would have a stake in improving them as well, because Sound Transit already has plans to expand their commuter train service to feature longer platforms. So we believe that some of the infrastructure costs are perhaps a little bit inflated beyond what would actually be necessary. But really what it's all about is the public support, which is amazingly strong. The consulting firm who conducted the study, STEER, stated that they had never seen public support for a rail project, or really any of the projects they'd examined, that high ever in their history. Over 70, like I mentioned, 77% of supporters, or 77% of the people they interviewed that they conducted outreach with stated that they were in support of it. And over 70% of participants agreed that they would try the service if it was made available to them. They had meetings with a lot of leaders in cities and counties up along the line, and they found significant interest in Yakima and Pasco. They found interest and support with the Yakima Nation, the tribe in the Yakima Valley. And they also found support from senior representatives of Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway. It's interesting when you can even get the freight railroad in support of the project, because a lot of times there's conflicts between passenger and freight, but this is a project that stakeholders on all sides were really interested in. And just as impressively, less than 5% of participants in their surveys stated any sort of opposition to the project whatsoever. So really what this means is that there's tremendous interest and then there are tremendous needs that need to be looked at. And STEER's own study stated that there's a lot of further work that can be done in order to look at this service and to make it possible, including looking at some of the track and station design, looking at some more specific infrastructure improvements, looking at more specific schedules, and really defining the service, because they presented a few outcomes, but there need to be a kind of final definitions in order to really determine what can and should go on. So that's the east-west service as it stands right now. And it fits into kind of are five major needs that we're working in here at All Aboard Washington. There are five major issues that we're really trying to deal with, kind of all at once in Olympia. The first is restoring services on existing routes. We understand, that as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the, the border complications, I guess we should say, that it is very difficult to restore service to Northwest Washington. But we understand that the existing connected transportation services there are not very good, and so that makes it really hard to for people in Whatcom and Skagit counties in particular, because they completely lack train service. Stanwood in northern Snohomish County is lacking service. So, we believe it's important that we restart service there as soon as possible. But we understand that that's going to depend on what's going on with the border situation. So that's a big challenge. Second, increasing frequencies on existing services as much as possible, particularly Amtrak Cascades. My colleague, Abe Zumwalt, who's a fellow board member at All Aboard Washington, he's really into data, and he took an analysis of some of Amtrak's ridership and frequency data to do an analysis of what happens when you increase the frequency of a train. How do train services across the country perform when you increase their frequency? And what he found was that there's sort of this exponential relationship where once you get to about 6 to 8 trains a day on a route, people don't have to look at the schedule anymore. People have enough options throughout the span of the day that they can take the train when they want. If they miss a train, or if their plans change, they can change to go to a train that's a little bit later, or if they need to leave earlier, they have a train that's available earlier, and therefore significantly more people start to take the train. This is definitely the case in the Amtrak Cascades corridor. This is the case in other corridors across the country, including with more urban and rural corridors. The more that you have good frequency, the easier it is for people to choose the train as an option, and therefore the more people who will ride. So we believe that doing as much to improve the frequency of our existing services, and particularly Amtrak Cascades, will help show more of the utility of rail and help get more people on the train and make it easier for people to ride rail across the entire region. Unfortunately, both of these, as restoring existing services and improving existing services, as well as adding new service, are going to be dependent on acquiring new train equipment. And that's a big problem that a lot of people don't talk about, that there's a significant shortage of rail equipment across the country, really across all of North America, including Canada. And there are efforts that are being done to try to improve that. Amtrak recently placed an order with Siemens Mobility, which has a large factory in Sacramento, California, to produce new equipment for the national network and for a lot of the state-supported services, including Amtrak Cascades. And representatives at WashDOT have said that we will be the first in line to receive the new state equipment once it's finished being made and being tested. But that's several years off. At earliest, we could expect to see it in maybe 4 years, maybe 5 years, perhaps even longer. So in the meantime, that means that while we're facing this equipment shortage, it's going to be very difficult to expand services. So we're trying to do the best we can with the existing equipment that we have, think creatively, avoid scrapping equipment that can be repaired and continue to be used for service. But that's a serious issue. Then it's about really changing our priorities and making sure that we build a robust rail and bus network, because we hear a lot of talk on the west side of the mountains about high-speed rail, which would be great. We would love to see that. Don't get us wrong. But we're facing needs on this side of Washington, on this side of Oregon, that are not being met. And there's no way that a high-speed rail project, much as we would love to see it, is going to receive any support if it's not contributing to better mobility across the entire region, if it's not serving both urban and rural communities. We believe, given our limited resources, both time and money and space, all of these things, we need to get our priorities straight. We need to make sure we make the most of our existing services, our existing infrastructure, upgrade that and leverage that as much as possible across the entire region, not just in urban corridors. So that way we're creating a truly connected network, and we're creating a system that everyone can get behind. If we were to make the most of our rail infrastructure, and then have a really good high-speed rail system connecting that, then that improves mobility for the entire region and not just the west side. We understand, according to one of our regularly engaged members who has worked in transportation services and data for a while, that the US is 40th in the world in terms of its use, its leveraging of its rail system. We're behind Mozambique. Mozambique is making better use of its existing rail network than the United States is. This, despite the fact that we have one of the largest rail networks in the whole world. This, despite the fact that we had the rail network that was the envy of the world for a number of decades, really almost a century. We can't have our heads up in the sky when we're facing serious needs on the ground. We think, in contributing to that Amtrak East-West service in the state really needs to be put forward. And there are two major points that need to be considered to move the East-West service forward. The first is conducting a cost-benefit analysis, which would measure the value of reductions in greenhouse gases, reduction in vehicle miles traveled, improvements to safety. What are the benefits and the cost to society of this service? And then we would need to be looking at an economic analysis, which would measure the impact on local businesses, on jobs, on tax revenues, quality of life, property values, all these sorts of things that would affect local communities in particular. Both the cost benefit analysis and an economic analysis would need to be conducted by the state of Washington. I believe a similar thing would be required of Oregon, in addition to some of the earlier studies defining things like ridership, in order for both of these services to be eligible for federal grant opportunities. But we understand that given the increasing emphasis on equity, the increasing interest in serving rural and underserved communities, that both projects would be competitive. And so conducting these will help lay the foundations for making them happen. And finally, within Washington, we believe that there's an opportunity to improve feedback channels because we know that Oregon doesn't have a ferry system, but the Washington State ferry system is one that's really strong. It's actually by definition of law included as part of the state highway system. And the riders and supporters of the ferry system have tremendous influence in Olympia. They make a lot of difference. They have very loud, strong voices, and their interests are very strongly considered in the whole transportation picture. In fact, if you go to your county auditor's office anywhere in the state and you pay your car tabs, the $8 car tab fee would actually go to fund the state ferries. You don't get the option to select whether or not it supports passenger rail or intercity buses or anything like that. And that's one reason for that is because the ferry riders, the ferry lobby, if you will, has a very strong voice in Olympia. And one part of that is the Washington State Transportation Commission's Ferry Riders Opinion Group, what's referred to as the FROG, as you can see there. We think that we need something similar for passenger rail and intercity bus service, both within the states of Washington and Oregon. So we're working as an organization to create a passenger rail opinion group to the Washington State Transportation Commission, because the commission can make advisory recommendations to the state DOT with regards to what to do with the service. So if we have passenger rail voices involved in that, we think that can do more. Additionally, an effort that's worth considering that our government affairs director, Luis Moscoso, is cooperating with AORTA on in Oregon is the creation of a state rail caucus. Washington has a legislative rail caucus in the legislature of officials who are interested in and have a stake in rail issues. And so they work together to help advance rail things. So our colleague is talking with several representatives and senators in the state of Oregon about doing the same thing. So that's a great opportunity to really get more momentum going for rail across the entire region and ideally improve cooperation between the states of Washington and Oregon. So the specific things we're asking for in Olympia that we'll be working on over the next session are these three things: taking the next steps on East-West, both the benefit and cost analysis and the economic impact analysis, which have to be conducted by the state. Restoring and expanding Amtrak Cascade service as much as possible. As we work on the issues with the border and with the equipment, we need to restore services to what they were pre-pandemic and continue our efforts to expand the services in the Cascades corridor. And finally, create a passenger rail opinion group to the Washington State Transportation Commission, because that will help rail riders be heard and keep improvements moving. Because we know that we've had conversations with the Transportation Commission. They're very interested in rail issues, and we'll be engaging with them a lot more. And so they want to hear more voices. Then that brings us to how you can help make a difference. What can you, as a citizen or a representative, elected official, what can you do in order to contribute to better rail connectivity in the Northwest? The first is awareness. The biggest challenge that we've run into is that a lot of people simply don't know that these projects exist. A lot of people don't know that the East-West project in Washington or that the Portland to Boise project in Oregon are something that are on the books, that are efforts. But when people know about it, they are tremendously supportive. Back in 2019, All Aboard Washington and Aorta participated in a meeting in La Grande, and there were over 100 people there, maybe 150 people who showed up at the La Grande Library interested in talking about passenger rail issues. So when people know, they come. So really talking with people that you know, getting the word out there about rail is the first step, and it's a tremendously important one toward making progress on these issues. The second is support from representatives, whether that's in your city, like your mayor or your city council, whether that's from the county, your county commissioners, or county level organizations, metropolitan planning organizations, whether that's in Olympia and Salem, talking with your representatives and senators in the state capitol to let them know about these issues, or whether that's in Congress. Our representatives in Washington, D.C. Are talking about this. So, and all of these representatives talk with each other. That's something we've been learning a lot about, just how well connected these are. And when we have these conversations with representatives in DC, in Olympia, and on the county and city level, people ask, does our senator support this? Do the mayors support this? All these sorts of things. So having these conversations with as many people as possible within elected government and within kind of the NGOs around makes a tremendous difference. And we have some talking points on how we can do this. It's about getting our priorities straight, focusing on equity, economics, and environment, making sure that accessibility and interconnectivity are the priorities, and not just getting from point A to point B a little bit faster. We need to be talking about making prudent short-term action. There are, needs that we desperately have to address that, don't have time for, continued planning. We know a lot of things. We've done a lot of studies. We've done a lot of research, and we have a lot of underused and existing resources, particularly infrastructure, that we can leverage. So we should be leveraging it. And we believe that a great way to do that is with better Amtrak Cascade service, improving East-West passenger rail service, making that a reality, and by expanding connecting bus services. Then finally, it's down to grassroots advocacy. There's a lot of work that goes into this. Charlie and I and Kathy and all of us at All Aboard Washington are really honored to be involved at this time, because it's the most exciting time for passenger rail really in history since the founding of Amtrak. What's being looked at in the Senate infrastructure bill is more support for intercity passenger rail than has ever been, period. And we need to take advantage of that opportunity. And there's a lot of work that we're trying to do as advocates in Olympia, and our colleagues in Oregon as well with Aorta are trying to do in order to make things happen. And it takes a lot of effort. We need a lot of volunteers. We need a lot of leadership, and we need a lot of money to make it happen. Our volunteers do a lot for us. They help us with community outreach and networking. They help us with writing content for our newsletter and for social media. They help us with editing our newsletter and getting it out to our members so that way people can stay informed with what's going on. And they help us with event planning, like with what's going on right now. We had a number of volunteers help us out with making these events possible, including here in Walla, including in Ritzville, lots of places like that. And that makes a tremendous difference in terms of our ability to spread the word. So we need help with volunteers. We need help with leadership. We have a board of directors and a number of executives who help make the critical decisions about the organization's direction that make it possible for us to achieve our mission. They help us with fundraising capacity. They help us with developing our organizational policy. They help us with our government affairs director reaching out to people in Olympia, and they help us with networking with officials, on the local level, the city level, the state level, and the national level. And finally, money. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of coffee for Patrick to be able to drive across the Northwest and to produce a lot of the materials that we have that help show people the possibilities. We have a great graphics designer who helps us out with a lot of things. And in order to make that happen, we need a lot of financial support. And based on what we're doing to do both the train track and the Big Sky Passenger Rail Summit, we need about $7,000 worth of resources in order to get there. And so anything that you can do or that your community can do to help, it makes an enormous difference, whether that's your own personal donations or whether that's connecting us with the leaders in your community who have an interest in what's going on and have a stake in the success of the service and the well-being of your community. So anything that you can do to help us really is amazing, and we appreciate it. So that brings us to our community discussion now. We want to hear from you about your ideas. What are the biggest challenges that you face here in Southeast Washington and Northeast Oregon? What are your top priorities for addressing these challenges? Is there anything that we're missing that you think is worth talking about that we should bring up in Olympia or Salem? We're working to make connections with people. We're working to make connections with local businesses. And that's really what it's all about. So yeah, we're happy to have a discussion.
Have you shared any of this with the Port of Walla?
Port of Walla, no, we have not. We don't have any connections with the Port of Walla.
Yeah, I would definitely. Pat Ray is the executive director. Pat
Ray, R-A-Y.
R-E-A-Y. He is the executive director. I would definitely get in touch with him. And the reason I say that, they're not just, well, they manage the airport, but they are huge advocates and involved in transportation, the Highway 12 project between here and Tri-Cities. They're huge supporters and, getting behind, trying to get that done. That's a highway project that should have been done decades ago, and they're still not done.
Mm-hmm.
And they have connections at the state and the DOT and stuff like that. The other one, I don't have her last name, but I have her card. I can send it to you. I talked to Valley Transit.
Valley Transit.
They are not owned by the city. They're their own bus entity. But they just got a grant, I think federal and state, don't quote me on that, for electric buses. There's 2. And they're, I think, also on board to get some more. And I got several things I wanted to add and talk about here. I don't want to keep you all day.
No, absolutely.
But going to talking about the bus connection.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly don't see how that can't happen now.
Exactly. Oh,
because
absolutely.
I've lived here 16 years, and I'll go back. I'll go back through my notes here. I've lived here 16 years. And almost every time I've mentioned to a group of people that Amtrak serves Pasco,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's a beautiful trip through the board and stuff. When I share that with people, and people are, around, they're like, "What? Amtrak goes through Pasco?"
Yeah.
They don't know.
Exactly.
And the reason I brought up Port of Walla is because Port of Walla does this huge marketing thing for the airport. True, they manage the airport, but they do radio spots. I don't know what they do online and social media. I know they have a Facebook page, but we're only served by one airline in this town, and that's Alaska Airlines. That's it. And then looking at your dots down to Pendleton, there's only one airline in Pendleton. Mm-hmm. But all the airlines, and not to compare apples to oranges, there is no airline service within 3 airports within an hour of here that goes to Spokane or Boise.
Exactly. Yeah, that's something we've talked about, is that almost everything goes through either Portland or Seattle. Yeah. And so you want to get in the more direct way. No, you don't have that option.
Right. And then just for clarity, when you started your presentation, you were talking about, let's see here, restoring and improving Cascade service. Are you talking strictly that red line, say from that Amtrak route Cascade?
That is the Amtrak Cascade service.
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
it's a state-funded service by Oregon and Washington,
Okay.
which pre-pandemic it offered 4 trips between Seattle and Portland, 2 trips between Seattle and Vancouver, BC, and 2 trips between Portland and Eugene.
The other thing I was just going to, you hit the nail on the head, because I've been in this situation where the gorge was closed in the wintertime.
Mm-hmm.
One time I had to get to Southern California for a funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing on this side of the Cascades was flying.
Mm.
The gorge was closed.
Yep.
I could make it to Pasco to catch the train, but the mail had to still get through
On the train.
on BNSF.
Yeah.
And I called Amtrak, and they're like, we're still, nothing's changed.
Yep.
But if you can get to Pasco, you can
Mhm.
get the train.
Mm-hmm.
I can get it, and then I had to get to LA like the next day.
Yeah.
For a funeral. So I took Amtrak from Pasco to Portland and then flew southwest from PDX to Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
California.
And you could
But
get there. It was the
That's
option.
and then recreationally, the one thing I would love to see, and if you want to take this to DOT, Olympia, Amtrak, whatever, we live in a gorgeous state.
We
So
do.
it's one thing to say, hey, I can catch the westbound Empire Builder from Pasco to Portland, get there, I don't care about the desert part of Pasco, when I get to Pasco, but by the time I get into the gorge, the sun's up, the gorgeous route.
It's an unbelievable. Yeah. I got the
And
chance to
I've
drive
told
that.
so many people, if you have the time, it's about the same time as driving,
Mhm.
but it's cheaper.
Yeah.
And then you were talking about the connectivity and the relationships, I don't know how many times I've taken the train to Portland for a meeting
Mhm.
to rest. The eastbound lanes are what used to, I don't know if it's changed since the pandemic at 3 or 3:30, something like that.
Mhm.
And you get back here at 7:38, whatever.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I mean, you can go and have a meeting in Portland. If Amtrak is downtown, or there's been times I've even flown and taken the train back or whatever. But the connectivity between the light rail in Portland to the airport and to Union Station, and everything is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I would just say it would be great if the port could get behind Amtrak, that
Mhm.
kind of thing. If it is the bus from Pasco, because here's the other thing.
Yeah.
And the port commissioners were just had this meeting. Port of Walla has a high dock or whatever in Burbank, where these cruise ships come up from Portland up the gorge. Well, then they bus, the cruise ship company bus folks over here for the exact thing you mentioned.
Yeah.
The tourist part of the thing. We got Port Walla Museum here, we got the winery, we got the 5-star restaurant. Why can't Amtrak, DOT, something, work together on some marketing campaign to bring the tourists, even if it's all people from either Seattle or Spokane, whoever it is, it doesn't matter.
It's
The
local
fact
exchange.
Is the word has to get out there, and I think that can happen today. We don't
Absolutely.
have to wait until Amtrak puts more trains on the tracks
Mm-hmm.
or whatever.
Yeah.
That's something that can happen today.
I haven't heard about a bus shortage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't see, And the other thing is, we do have, and I don't know what their size of buses are, we have wine tour companies. We have a
Mhm.
handful here that have what I would say like the airport bus connection. I'm not talking about the Greyhound side bus.
Yeah.
Maybe they do.
Yeah. But maybe like the 14 passenger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there may not be any more at this time than 14 passengers wanting to come to Walla off of one of the trains to spend a weekend, even a day, or whatever, or one night. I don't know. But that's something I think that could be starting sooner than later.
Absolutely. No, and I think it should be, because when it's harder to get to a place, the more steps you have to go through, the more hassle you have to go through, the harder it is for people to enjoy that experience. Like we said, from the 11% diverted ridership. So yeah, we think that we would agree there's tremendous opportunity, in Southeast Washington and Northeast Oregon for better tourism, better, visiting, and just overall better connections if we had these options available.
And the other thing I was curious about too is, would there be any deviation to the Stampede route to say it swung out further east through Walla Walla?
Oh, that's absolutely possible. Yeah, you know about the tracks here.
Right.
So, and that's actually, that's exactly kind of where we're starting with this map here. It's difficult to come up with a map that can very easily display kind of just everything. And this is focusing specifically on, okay, these are, a combination of projects on the books and, in the case of like the extended bus service, something that should be really, really easy to do that will improve the connectivity. But it really, what you can do is, if we get things going with the East-West project, expanding that service between Seattle and Spokane, you've worked on most of the trackage there to get down to Boise and Pendleton and to get to Walla Walla. So it would be pretty easy once you've gotten a lot of those Stampede Pass tracks restored to extend services with just a few more track improvements to Walla Walla and a few more track improvements between the Tri-Cities and Hermiston.
Right.
Umatilla.
And the other thing I was really happy to hear you share this morning, you were talking about the different stakeholders that are interested in this. And I was glad to hear that BNSF, is on board, the Yakima Nation. My question with Yakima Nation is, being that I guess both Yakima and Toppenish, you said, or was it Toppenish and Posher? There was two stations that are privately owned.
Yes, and
Toppenish and Ellensburg.
Ellensburg. As far as Toppenish is concerned, has there been discussion or any talks where maybe the tribe would be interested in building that station?
Yes.
There has been, okay.
Yeah. In fact, when we were in Toppenish yesterday, the folks who run the museum were there, and they said, yes, absolutely, this can be done.
Yeah.
they're working on building restoration projects. What would really, the only thing that would be necessary would be constructing an ADA compliant station platform.
Nice. Okay.
And my understanding, if I understood them correctly, I believe the city of Toppenish owns the building, but then it's leased to the museum.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
But the city of Toppenish people were there too, and they were supportive as well. The city manager was there. One of the city council people were there. So the city's good to go with it, and the museum people. In fact, they said that when they started that museum quite some time ago, they anticipated that there would be trains, that there would be passenger trains.
Going back to the Port of Walla for just a moment, they do own, I'm sure, I don't know if they own the rail spurs or not, you'd have to check, but they own a very large business park out in the Walla Burbank area, right along the river. So, there may be some, I'm not in any association with them, other than I know them. But I mean, I don't want to be quoted as, yeah, they'll be on board, but I mean,
Yeah.
it would definitely be something to look into.
That would be interesting. And two interesting points here, because Washington State does actually publish a rail ownership map. Here it is right here, and that can actually clarify who owns it if we can get past the ads. Let's see, you might have a better copy of it in the Google Drive. I'll just try to see if I can open it right here.
Yeah, we do have.
Can we see that? Okay, so it looks like up to from Burbank or so to Walla Walla, it's owned by the Union Pacific Railway, and then outside of that up to Dayton, which is where the rails terminate right now, that is owned by the Port of Columbia.
Now, I will say that UP had a cold storage facility that the port was involved in Burbank, Walla area, and they just shut that down here, I would say within the last year.
So
that was the RailX facility that UP bought out RailX, and that was to ship cold storage from, let's see, I think they were shipping it from here to another facility identical to the one here to
Okay.
New York.
Okay.
It was like a 2-day train trip.
Okay.
But they just shut that down. But the facility's still there,
I see.
you know.
Here, I'm gonna look at, I'm just curious to look at some of that, because I know, yeah, Burbank is right here in the northwest corner of Walla Walla County. So,
You would actually.
and the business park as well. I was curious about both.
It'd be south.
South, okay.
South of the state.
Oh, is it that really big facility?
Yeah,
Right here, this one?
No, up,
Up
right.
here. This,
That's it,
this one
yeah.
with the circle, okay,
So this is right, this is the old cold storage,
okay,
and then that's the wine, that's wine.
that's wine,
Yeah.
okay,
And that's still, the
Hmm.
wine is still,
okay.
yeah.
But so you think that, so with the cold storage going down, that's something that's probably hurt UP and all that stuff going on, so
Yeah, the port would know about that.
the port would know about
The
that.
port was very, I would say shocked. Yeah,
I see. And what about that business park you were talking about in Burbank?
that's all down in that area.
All that, okay, this,
Yeah.
including this down here, this thing, kind of all
the
this.
port would know- yeah, it's the Walla Dot, yeah, so see right there to the right of the rail that's
Okay.
Tyson Foods.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a farm, yeah, okay.
That's all, that's a port tenant, if I remember right. Yeah, port owns a whole bunch of land out
Okay,
there. Yeah.
so I could see how if you could have a stop, you know, either serving there or serving Burbank, and to combine that with some freight rail improvements, that would be something of interest. Okay, well, and seeing that most of this seems to be owned by a combination of UP and then the Port of Columbia, I wonder if there would be some sort of way, if we were to pull a Virginia here, look at all of the, you know, potential rail improvements, get some county input, get port input, get state input, regional input, all that, see if there's a way, maybe if UP is declining on some business, maybe we could purchase tracks.
And I would say definitely, you know, the best person to contact would be the port, because
Okay,
and they may have put some rail improvements in there, because I know they've been putting some money into the Walla Dot business park, and Port of Walla Walla has a website.
Okay.
okay,
Yeah, if Washington State and several of the ports do own some tracks, it's scattered
Yep.
here and there. If you go back to that,
you can see WashDOT owns a lot of track here in Eastern Washington in particular. They actually bought those lines and then subcontract grain freight services out there. So it's nicknamed the grain train.
They're on there constantly. I used to
Yep.
drive Tri-Cities every day.
Yep.
5 times a week.
So you see,
Yeah,
yeah,
you'll see the grain trains out there.
and there's another one down toward Pullman. And
Yep.
there's even some in the Puget Sound that are owned by various ports. So, you know,
Mhm.
it's an interesting mishmash. But a lot of them are run by, you know, subcontracted out to short lines and what have you. So it's, but.
The other one I would suggest also to talk to would be the Walla Valley Chamber of Commerce.
Yep.
And there is a, separate from the chamber, there is, I'm gonna say this wrong, Visit Walla Walla.
Oh, okay.
I actually talked to those folks. when we
Okay.
were looking at this, doing this meeting, and,
But what I was saying as far as marketing, you know, take the train, I guess, to Walla. I'm sure there's more clever way, I'm not advertising.
yeah.
There's better way to make that. zing
Something,
with people. But you know what I'm saying? It's-
Rails to wine.
Yeah, right.
Well, one of the people who was going to be at the meeting today is from the Walla Walla Wine Organization.
And there's also a, and the port can tell you about this. There's I want to say commission, a coalition of local businesses that push and talk, I guess, and visit with Alaska Airlines to keep them here. But I don't see why they couldn't push rail too.
Yeah.
Um,
Some sort of.
and there, because
transportation.
we have We have the Corps of Engineers at the big office, they're just right across the street here. You have Key Technology, you have three colleges, universities here.
Right.
We used to have 2 hospitals, but then Providence took over the Adventist Hospital.
Mhm.
But, and again, the whole tourist thing.
Yeah, we have some connections with the state wine board or whatever
Okay.
it's called. And we know there's a lot of interest in this part of the world.
You may get the, I'm just going out on a limb here, guessing here on this. You may get some of these big industries here to write letters of support, saying, hey, Amtrak needs to have more trains so that, my understanding, the Corps is fighting right now to get a Portland flight out of here because they have so many meetings that they have to go to Portland for.
Why not extend east-west train service? It couldn't be that hard. Yeah.
Well, I know,
Extend the bus. Yeah, no,
right.
yeah, precisely. So they're
Yeah.
interested in it. They want to see it.
Right.
Yeah.
But I
They wanna
would
see
say,
that.
I would say if Amtrak had more trains, like you were saying with the Cascade thing,
Mhm.
you know, to where they could jump on either a train in the evening, spend that's only one night, and then they're back at a reasonable time the next day. Or if you're still gonna have that, what, 3.5, 4 hours,
Mhm.
I don't,
As it exists right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, because the Columbia River route, I mean, that's a challenge, you know, because on the one hand, we at All Aboard and Aorta as well are absolutely, I'm actually on the board of both,
okay.
but you know, we're all in favor of trying to expand the services on the existing corridors as much as possible. You know, much like what you might have heard happen recently in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where both states just passed funding to create a second train a day between the Twin Cities and Chicago. You know, because when we were at a meeting in Wenatchee, which is served by the Seattle leg of the Empire Builder, they talked about how, you know, with the train coming all the way from Chicago, sometimes it'll come in 3, 4, 5 hours late from stuff that happened in Montana or North Dakota.
Right.
And so that holds back the train for everybody and doesn't leave any schedule flexibility. So if you were to run, I don't know, an additional 2 or 3 trains a day between Seattle and Spokane via Wenatchee and Leavenworth, then that means that at least those trains aren't dealing with the delays that long. But the challenge with that, and a similar challenge for running more service between Spokane and Portland along the existing Empire Builder corridor, is that those are the busiest 2 of the 3 east-west routes within Washington. The Columbia River route is, of course, the shallowest. It doesn't have as big of elevation changes. And I know there are several single track tunnels and things like that that make for some challenging passing maneuvers. So that route is always quite busy. And then Stevens Pass is the shallower of the 2 mountain routes. It's not as steep as Stampede Pass as well. And additionally, Stampede Pass does not have it has a tunnel that's just tall enough for superliner trains, the double decker Amtrak equipment, but it doesn't have a tunnel that's tall enough for double stack freight. So all of the double stack freight has to go through that's going across the northern route has to go through Stampede Pass. And as a result, BNSF sends some of the empty coal trains and oil trains through Stampede Pass, while the taller trains and the heavier trains go through Stevens Pass. So that means Stevens Pass is quite busy, and the Columbia River route is quite busy. But you know, in terms of what would be a good service to provide, it would definitely make sense to provide daytime service, not just in the new Stampede Pass corridor, but also to try to expand frequencies on the existing Stevens Pass and Columbia River routes.
And I was going to ask, so you mentioned the California bus connection. So I grew up in the Central Valley. I'm from Bakersfield.
So you know, oh yeah.
So I traveled Amtrak. I went to school in Northern California.
Yeah.
So home was Bakersfield. Went to school in Northern California. It was a 6-hour train trip. You know, and I did it as much as I could. And then, you know, I think they had added, if I recall, you know, all these people sitting on the train in backpacks. They were getting off at Merced, taking the bus to Yosemite.
Exactly. Yes.
And they were marketing it now.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
And I'm like, what?
Amtrak.
The train doesn't go. I was sitting there in the back of the dining car, and I'm like, what do you mean you're going to Yosemite? You can't go to Yosemite. Yeah. The bus picks us up at our set and takes us to the valley floor.
It's called the YOLO bus.
Yeah, yeah.
Club.
And I'm all like, but then I got off in Martinez because I was going to school in the Napa Valley.
Yeah.
And they would drop us off at the, another train station for the Napa Valley wine train.
Yeah.
So, usually I had a buddy pick me up in Martinez and then we'd eat and shop and, you know, I wouldn't ride the bus, but it was, we need that here.
Exactly. You know, as much flack as California gets for, you know, some of the things that have been going on with that, you know, that high-speed rail project, what they've really done right is they focused on making an interconnected system. They're not just building high-speed rail. They're building much better commuter rail in the Bay Area. They're expanding Metrolink service in Southern California. They're making improvements to the San Joaquin service. They're making improvements to Amtrak Thruway service. So, you know, and that's really what's helping carry the project through because, you know, despite the, you know, the contentious issues around high-speed rail, people across the state are still seeing benefits from the project because it's including other things than just high-speed rail. And it's really making that grid. I mean, there's a great graph that that California had. I'll see if I can find that in one of the presentations we had here, but my colleague Abe brought it up where it showed, if you look at that map, you would be forgiven for not finding which of the lines on there was high-speed rail because they weren't making such a big deal about, oh, this is the only service. They were showing all of the connections between all of the services.
Yeah.
Actually, here, let me see if I can find that.
I mean, Bakersfield is an enormous hub between the trains and you can get a bus. It's an Amtrak bus that goes from Bakersfield to kind of everywhere in Southern California. You know, they've got a whole bunch of things that go from there. And so Bakersfield is, as you probably know.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is it right here. They're showing that you can get kind of anywhere in the state and they're not even making too big of a deal of high-speed rail. You'd almost think, oh, is it really all that different from all the other services? And that's because they're not making this big deal about, you know, oh, this is the only service. It's one method of connecting the entire state. So that's definitely something California has really gotten right.
Yeah, I lived in, my wife and I lived in Upland when we first got married, just north of Ontario International. And in just a few years before we moved up here, the Orange Line, the Gold Line, all that was built almost overnight.
Yeah.
Down there, so yeah. And then Orange County, but the way everybody worked together was, there was a lot of fighting, don't misunderstand me, but it eventually got done. And it seemed like everybody, as far as the ridership, you were never on a empty train. No matter where you went.
Yeah.
And LA Metro is working, like they're putting everything that they can to build as much rail out as possible.
Yeah.
You know, everything that they can to expand rail. They're really putting in, and Metrolink has been a success. It's really interesting to see what that's done for Southern California and providing the options.
I mean, I will say this, the difference, however, north of Sacramento, there's not much.
Right.
Okay. But anything south of Sacramento is extremely covered.
I know people right now commuting from Auburn up near Truckee.
Yeah.
Commuting from Auburn to San Francisco daily.
I can believe
Yeah.
this.
They're, as far as I know, they're not married. So they're not married because I don't see how they can survive having a family commuting like that. But they work in downtown San Francisco. But they get so much work done. They take
The Capital Corridor.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, and we understand, you know, from the conversations we were having like with people in Wenatchee that even some of that stuff is changing here in the Northwest. For example, we were hearing that there's discussions now going on between Chelan County and Grant County with regard to you know, the potential for building more data centers in Grant County, and Wenatchee being a commuting hub from of Grant County data centers. And we understand that there's a similar thing with potentially the Tri-Cities and Seattle, how there might be some interest in like trying to do an express train that would go from the Tri-Cities area because there are enough business commuters to Seattle and Portland.
Go back to Abe's frequency chart for a second.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You were talking about, you never saw an empty train, okay? One of the things that's interesting about this chart is that you will see that one, you just went, there you go. You'll see where it says Pacific Surf Line, okay? And those are the ones that have the most frequencies.
Right.
And you'll notice that this graph goes like that. And so the more frequencies that you have, the more ridership you get. And you'll notice that the Cascades is just on the brink of having an enormous increase in ridership just by having more frequencies. And California is already there on the Capital Corridor and the Surfliner and a couple of the other ones.
You can see if the San Joaquins was expanded to be a little bit more frequent, it could very well join it, despite the fact that it's serving, a less densely populated corridor than either the Surfliner or the Capital.
And as far as, I guess, if you were to break down, not so much the demographic, but what the reason they're riding, would the Surfliner be more tourists than, say, commuters?
I don't know
I
as
don't
much
think
about
so.
that. I'd love to forward you the link to Corridor Conversations, because I think they talked about that in there. And there was a really great discussion about how the San Joaquins actually had the lowest percentage drop of the three major California corridors because of the fact that it was serving people who really needed to be making essential trips. So that's an important point to consider.
Yeah, and the Surfliner is, when I've been on it, is, I would argue that it's probably splits it a couple of different ways. You've got local tourism, people are doing day trips.
Yeah.
You've got people who are coming from further away, but you've got a lot of commuters as well.
Oh, okay.
Now, I'm sure they've done research on that, but my guess is that it's all of the above.
Right. Now, I do know people here that have either flown or driven to Seattle or caught it in, is that the one that goes all the way down from Seattle to LA?
Yes, the Coast Starlight, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
I know people from here that have made that a vacation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, some have done it round trip, some have only done it one way and then flown back.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Based on,
But I know many people from right here at the Walla Valley that have done it. I have not. It's on the bucket list.
Yeah, it's a great trip.
It's a great trip. You should definitely do it.
He's done it all the way. I've done it as far as Sacramento, but it's a really nice ride.
My kids had not been on Amtrak, so 2 Thanksgivings ago, we flew from here to Fresno on Alaska. Because Bakersfield, you can't, isn't served by Alaska. And then we rode Amtrak from Fresno to the San Joaquin.
Yeah.
From Fresno to Bakersfield.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
My only complaint on that trip was, for some reason, we waited forever to get an Uber. So we had to take a cab.
Yeah.
It's not cheap. From the airport to Amtrak.
Yeah.
Was insane.
And that's something we're working in better. Connecting bus service plays a really important role. I recently visited Hawaii, and one thing that I thought was really great about it, and that a lot of people talk about, is just how good the bus service is on Oahu. They have a really great connecting bus service that, a lot of times it's not the fastest way to get around just given the traffic, but everybody's stuck in traffic. So I guess, so it's not too big of a deal. The biggest thing is that, connecting the airport with a lot of the tourist attractions and whatnot made it easy to get around. And that's an example where if you, provide that sort of service there, make it an easy connection. And particularly if you can connect an airport with Amtrak or any other, local transit services, you've got a really good network going on there. I could see probably a similar benefit here in Walla Walla, depending on, what goes on with a potential rail expansion, what goes on with the airport. And yeah, those electric buses, that's great to hear that there's, the interest in the electric buses here.
The other thing about the buses that we were talking about is, Patrick mentioned North Carolina, okay? what they've been doing is they have been creating bus connections to the train to just test how much ridership there is. And the idea is that the ones that are successful, they'll turn into a train.
Like
Okay?
Asheville, for example.
Yeah, and that's, Virginia's doing that too. So, you know, you test it and you say, okay, you know, let's see what kind of ridership we get. And if we do, then we'll turn it into a train. And that makes all the sense in the world. You know, the ones that we're talking about for your corner of the state, you know, we think that the potential is significant for the ones that we've got marked there. And also, I mean, right now there is a throughway bus that goes from Spokane to Pullman and then down to Boise. Okay. Now, that's not the shortest trip in the world, but there's a lot of interest. And of course, there's a lot of potential there because you've got Pullman with, you know, teen students, you've got the Boise people are jumping up and down to, you know, to create service again.
Commuter rail and long distance service. They actually, Elaine Clegg, who's a part of the city council of Boise, has stated that one of the projects that's of interest there is actually starting commuter rail. So she thinks that there's some good synergies there with investment in commuter rail and trains.
With me when I talked to
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing too, when you talk to the port, we had I don't know if they would know the frequency. We had a couple years ago a flight from here to Boise, and it was a small plane. I don't think it did well, but I don't recall the complaint I always had was I don't remember that airline ever marketing
The flight. Yeah.
I guarantee you grab 10 people off the street and say, did you know we have air service to Boise from Walla? They'd be like, huh? I was working for a TV station at the time, and I remember we were always going after them, like, you guys need to advertise.
Yeah. It's a simple thing that a lot of things forget. And you know, what we're really happy to see is that now kind of post-pandemic, we've seen that Oregon is actually really working on trying to advertise the Amtrak Cascade service. Charlie and I took a train trip from Seattle to Eugene, and on the way back, there was a delay. And so we walked into the Salem station while we were waiting for things to continue going. And we saw some marketing materials in there where they had a little sort of sign or poster type thing. And we had heard the same in a conversation that we had with Karen Criswell, who works in the Oregon DOT for kind of the rail side of things. And she was talking about that, how they were working to do more advertising. So it's a simple thing, but it makes a difference.
And I was going to ask, okay, so you have DOT, and they oversee rail also, not just highways.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So do they work with other state agencies to promote like state parks? I mean, I could see a marketing campaign, ride the train to go to Walla down in Wine, you know, we got Blues Falls, we got the Blues.
If they do, I've never heard of it. Okay, I mean,
They should.
Well, you know, this is the silo problem. You know, I mean,
I'm just throwing ideas up against the wall.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And I mean, the crazy thing that we learned, you know, that data we got from Experience Washington, that's very new data. And the reason why is because Experience Washington was out for a long time, and they only were just reestablished like in 2019. I mean,
just thinking of state parks, you got Sacagawea and Pasco, you got Blues Falls between us and Lewiston. I don't know what else is out that way. Oh, you got Lewis Park State Park right out here in Dayton.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is I don't see why they couldn't work together.
And they should.
And they should.
And if they feel better saying, we don't care how you get there, it's rail, bus, train, bike, who cares? So they can at least add it. I mean.
No, totally.
And on the national level, it's been off and on over many years. Amtrak, it goes through times when they don't do any advertising at all, and then they go through times when they do something.
I just saw a TV commercial for Amtrak for the first time. Yeah, they just showed it. Yeah, and they showed this family, you know, this young family going to see grandma in another city and they showed the Amtrak.
yeah.
I was like, okay, yes, finally,
I did see that one.
You saw that?
One on
Yeah.
social media just this morning before coming to this.
Mhm.
It literally, it's just a coffee mug. And it's somebody walking up the stairs, walking down the aisle, and then going into a spacious area of the train. And then the graphic basically is just welcome aboard, we're
Mhm.
not crowded, there's no middle seat, and there's
Yeah.
no, it says something like no trash bag. You know, the way the airline, some of the airlines are just
Yeah,
throwing trash
walking.
bags over the seat you're not supposed to sit in.
Yeah.
And the way it was done, it was very clever, but all it is it's just a hand
Yeah.
with a coffee mug, and then somebody puts their bag down on their seat. And then it comes up with a full screen thing about like the Amtrak website, phone number, toll free number, and then the next one is the feet are out.
Yep. Don't have to put your bag under your seat. You can
Yep.
kick your feet
Yeah.
out.
And you can the subliminal messages, we're not an airline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you
Yes.
know, But
That's good.
it's a clever app.
Mhm.
So the other question I was gonna ask is.
One of the better ones they did a few years ago. So
Mm.
go ahead.
A lot of talk right now, especially in the northeast corridor and stuff. And I couldn't quote what the president has said and not said, but there's been a lot of talk that I guess he's claimed to be the.
Amtrak Joe is his nickname.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
he's a big rail.
Yes. Mhm.
My question is, I know, I guess the infrastructure package is still out there and all this. There's a lot of talk about those areas that either have an established route, they'd like to see those grow. But what's being done, not by your group, but state, our senators, whatever, to say, look, hey, we have an interest out here too.
Yeah, the national level.
Specifically, yeah,
Yeah.
and basically cash in on the love that our president has of rail, not just for back there, but I guess across the country.
We're actually working pretty hard at that.
Okay.
There is, go to the GNW website. Dan Bilka, one of the people from the Rail Passengers Association, which is the national group.
Yeah,
He's one of their board members, and he's from, click that and make it bigger.
This one, this,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a little hard.
okay,
yeah.
okay.
This-
I
this-
have seen this.
Yeah, because you've seen the Connect America map, and what we did was we drew a circle on it where there was absolutely nothing being proposed. We're like, hey, people live here too.
Right.
We're, because they're completely forgetting about service, to Eastern Oregon and Boise, completely forgetting about Central and Eastern Washington service.
So,
Yeah, I'll be honest, if you're recording, whatever,
Mhm.
I'm not ashamed to say, it, I questioned that. When they had the latest,
Mhm.
if Amtrak does this is what it would look like, and
Yeah.
I thought, there's still some dots you can connect here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, and Rail Passengers Association, which I'm a member of, and I'm actually a
Yeah.
council representative for Washington State of. We've made that clear that, yeah, there's a few holes here. There are a few places that need to be connected. And my close friend and colleague who we will actually be meeting with in Montana, his name is Dan Bilka. He's originally from South Dakota. He's living in Denver right now, and he's on his way to Montana via Wyoming, and he's having a bunch of conversations with people in Wyoming. He wrote a great article rebutting some points made. Yeah, in Railway Age, rebutting some of the points that were made by this lobbyist dude who's helped the highway industry spend billions on highways, and then says, oh no, well we shouldn't build trains in rural America.
and
Yeah, I'm gonna load that up for you. It's a great one.
The good news is that people like Senator Tester basically put in the infrastructure bill, you will serve rural America. You will serve, a national network. And, Senator Tester made it very clear, if you read the infrastructure bill, that they are basically telling Amtrak, don't try and think you can get away with not serving it because you need to put up with it.
I think I can find it in a Facebook message a little easier, but
Yeah.
it was good.
But anyway, that's one of the reasons why we're going to Big Sky next week, is that we will be talking to everybody in the Northwest, both in Canada and the United States,
Mhm.
about these sorts of issues. And a lot of people that we talk to are very powerful.
Yes, Stephen Ratner, Wyoming needs passenger trains too. Yep,
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
I'll be happy to send that to you.
This is the kind of stuff that, infuriates us, because on the one hand, I live on the East Coast. Yes, the East Coast needs what it needs, but that doesn't, it's not an either or. I mean, it is, and I live in Baltimore that has, a tunnel that's 130 years old, and they've got to replace it. Granted, that's important, you gotta do it. And, there's one in New York and various other things. But that doesn't mean that you just do that to the exclusion of our corner.
Yeah, it doesn't, it doesn't mean that we should be, forgetting, all these other places right here. Yeah. So it's,
We may be making t-shirts.
Yeah.
I
Well,
love,
I can tell you, traveling on both the Empire Builder, the San Joaquins, those are the only two that I've been on, and I don't know, I consider myself a people person, so you're on the train for a while, you're talking to people, and it's like, why'd you pick Amtrak?
Yeah,
Mhm.
It's inexpensive way to travel compared to flying,
Mhm.
if you don't have to be there right then, right now.
Yep.
That kind of thing. But then just talking to the people in this area, I'm not gonna spend the one thing I hear so much when we're going to Portland is, I'm not gonna spend the money to fly to Seattle when I don't need to.
yeah.
Because that's what you'd have to do for flying out of here or Tri-Cities.
Yep.
Well, and the folks in Yakima were talking about, if you want to get from Yakima to Spokane, you got to fly to Seattle to do that.
Yeah.
And that's where it costs $240,
Yeah.
via that.
Yeah.
No, and like you say, as a people person, I've found in my travels with Amtrak that I've been able to have lots of really great conversations and make friends on the train. And Charlie will say the same thing too. Charlie and I actually rode the Cardinal from Alexandria, Virginia to Chicago, and we made friends with a family that was coming back from DC to Michigan, and I'm still friends with that person online. I actually met up with her in Grand Rapids a while ago. So but I've never quite made a friend like that on the plane.
And
It's just a different
this
experience.
map might be some of the reason some of these new startup budget airlines
Mhm.
are doing what they're doing. Read, I know I'm gonna say it wrong, it's ABELO.
Yes.
Read their business model. They
Yeah.
are flying from Pasco to Burbank now.
Yep.
They just started, my kids are coming back,
Pasco to Burbank. Oh, California.
Pasco, Washington.
I was thinking Burbank,
No, sorry.
California.
My Burbank, California. And the whole business model is, they're coming out of Montana
Mhm.
Yeah.
and other, going to LA. Well,
I know Bozeman has exploded as an airport. I've heard that.
Yeah,
For
but-
that
but
reason,
their
yeah.
whole business model is these people don't want to go through Denver, go through Portland, through Seattle. They want to get to Southern California,
Mhm.
pure and simple.
Yeah.
And in 90 minutes from my mom and dad, my kids went down to see grandma and grandpa,
Mhm.
and a bunch of cousins and aunts and uncles and stuff. And they were down there for 3 weeks. And so we were looking at airlines and the pandemic and everything. It's just easier for teenagers not to make connecting flights.
Yeah.
It's a 2.5-hour flight to Tri-Cities.
Yeah.
And they were down there and the kids loved it.
Mhm.
But then I didn't know that much. My hands were both up.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that much about the airline. And so I Googled. And just the business model is, I think they're based out of Texas, if I remember right.
Mhm.
But the guy that started it had been in some other airlines over the years, and he branched off and started this one.
Mhm.
And it's a new airline, but his whole basis is connecting people to where they want to go, but making it short, sweet, point to point, basically.
Yeah.
Now, it's not daily,
Mhm.
but
It's an additional option.
It has a lot to do with that philosophy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
And we think that there are a lot of ways in which, given one thing you've probably heard about here in Washington is how there's a serious discussion on trying to create a second SeaTac airport. Probably in Thurston County where I live. I don't want to see a second SeaTac in Thurston County. And that really brings up a question which very few people have seemed to think about. What if we just made better use of our existing resources? What if we, and particularly rails, we know that the federal government has the Essential Air Service program.
that's what Pendleton.
With Pendleton, yeah. So what if we did something similar with trains? In terms of better connecting places, essential rail service. Connecting places where the states don't seem to be interested in doing it, and it's not eligible as a federal service under Amtrak's regulations of needing to be 750 miles or longer.
Doesn't the state pay a huge portion of the Cascades?
Yes, the fare box recovery for WashDOT, I don't know if this is for the entire corridor, but I understand at least in terms of Washington, is something along the range of 66%. So that means ticket sales covered 60% before the pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic, it's been hard. But pre-pandemic, 66% of the operating costs were actually covered by ticket sales, but the rest is funded by WashDOT and ODOT.
And the reason is because the national Amtrak law, as it's currently written, requires that any train that goes less than 750 miles must be paid for by the states.
That was not the case in the past. There were a few state-supported services, but a lot of them, including Cascades, received at least partial federal support. But starting in 2013, that federal support was phased out, and now it's dependent pretty much entirely upon the states or whatever funding they come up with. So that's led to instances where a political disagreement between a state has led to a cut in service. For example, there was that huge project going on. Indiana cut service because their state legislature was like, we don't want to do this anymore. There was the case where there was some political, kerfuffling between the states of Wisconsin and Illinois and whatnot over expanding services. And so, the sudden change in government in Wisconsin cut that service.
I asked Charles a week or two ago, and I was going to get your take on this. So if some billionaire or whatever woke up one day and says, "Hey, I want in on this," what I want to get your take. What would stop them from moving forward or making a proposal to say, "Hey, I'll put trains in there. I'll build a network," or whatever. Other than I guess the legislature would have to approve it.
There'd be a lot in the way. I mean, a big thing to consider is space. Where are you going to build it? As much as be great. Are you talking now? Are you talking about in terms of redoing existing services? Or are you building a new line?
Say, what is it? Branson's doing the thing to Vegas or whatever.
Yeah.
But if he said, "Hey," if Bill Gates woke up one day and said, "Hey, I'm done building computers. I want to spend some of my money and build a train, a railroad."
So
It's Dan's already heard my response to this.
Okay, yeah. Well, so I mean, there are a few things that are complicated. I mean, first of all, is that these projects are tremendously expensive, and almost any private venture that has tried to go into building a rail system pretty much has public support in some way, shape, or form. Let's take Brightline as an example. Brightline, are you familiar with them?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that extension to Orlando, as well as the one to Tampa, and their project down in Las Vegas, all of those, despite the expenditure of quote unquote private money, has some sort of state backing of some sort. They're getting some sort of support, whether it's in the case of Florida, they're securing a lot of the right of way from FDOT that they can use on the Tampa corridor. And the project is dependent on that. And then in the case of the Las Vegas project, they're really dependent on state grants from California and Nevada in order to make it happen. So even when you're talking about spending private money with a fully private entity, there's usually some sort of public support that they're looking for in order to make it happen. And they usually justify it with public benefit, which is understandable.
Right.
In the case of what's going on with the Northeast, there's a lot of stuff that's been talked about for years of a private consortium of sorts taking over the operations of the Northeast Corridor. But that again is something where, you know, I don't know if it was like $10 billion of private money was something where they wanted to have a certain amount of federal guarantees behind that, or a certain amount of federal investment behind that. That was even more than what the private money is. So I guess if there's anything, it's that there's a lot of risk involved with the project itself. There are potential construction delays, you know, inflation risks, things like that, that make for potential problems. There are other complications that go about. Obviously, we've had a pandemic right now that knocked out several private transportation companies like Bolt Bus, things like that, that make it a very difficult justification for a private endeavor. But usually the problem is with infrastructure. It's not so much with private services. What we've seen is that in Europe, there are some experimental models whereby the publicly owned, constructed, and operated or publicly owned and constructed and maintained infrastructure is in some cases being leased out to private or semi-private entities that want to take advantage of it. A great example is the Italian high-speed rail network. Trenitalia was the very first national operator to open up their high-speed rail network to private competition. And something similar is now kind of going on with the likes of Eurostar and other private entities. So it's not impossible to get private industries invested, but a lot of the times it's easier to get private entities interested in operations than it is with infrastructure.
Okay.
How does that align with what you were talking about?
Well, it's good because we didn't overlap very much, I don't think.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with what Patrick said. And I think the stuff that we talked about earlier, man, you know, I mean, again, it's, I would just go back historically and say, you know, there, with very few exceptions, there has never been transportation infrastructure built that was not done at least partially in the public sector. Okay. If you, I mean, you know, trains, you know, highways, everything. You know, of course, you know, with planes, you're talking about the air traffic control system. You know, with roads, that's obvious. You know, nobody has built, going back to the Romans, I suppose, you know, it's always been a public thing. And I got fascinated by reading about in the early 19th century that one of the things that the Whig Party was in favor of was what they called internal improvements, which is what we would call infrastructure.
Right.
Because that was really forward-looking at the time. You know, the idea that, you know, the government should pay for roads and canals and stuff like that was very unusual. So, you know, it was, that I think was perhaps the beginning of, you know, the sorts of discussions that we've had ever since. You know, there are lots of philosophical reasons why you should or should not pay for that kind of infrastructure. But I think most people would say that what would we do without it? You know, because if that is not an appropriate function of government, then what is? Because it's not something that even if you're Bill Gates, you can afford to do.
And that's been a serious inconsistency with regards to our transportation network now that, you know, there are plenty of good reasons you could give for, you know, trying to, you know, whether it's subsidizing infrastructure or making infrastructure, you know, pay for itself, whatever. But in any case, there hasn't been a very good consistency with that. There's the expectation that in the case of public transit services like passenger rail, like, you know, bus service, that it should pay for itself. And meanwhile, we continue to heavily subsidize our public road network. We continue to heavily subsidize air traffic control. And when we try to push for those the private operators that leverage that public infrastructure to pay their fair share. A lot of times it's met with opposition, or it significantly threatens the stability of their business model. So it's a very complicated subject, but what I think we've seen in a lot of instances around the world, regardless of whether there's more of a push for privatization or public ownership and use operation of infrastructure, is that there are better network effects that are considered. And I think one thing that I think might be interesting to kind of leave you off with is what I've got up on the screen right now, which is a discussion. It was actually an article written by someone that Charlie and I had a discussion with. He's a gentleman who's from Washington originally. He's currently living in Japan for work, but he's really interested in rail projects, and particularly with what he's seen and in his travel and working abroad experiences. He brought up the East-West project a little bit, and some of the opposition that people gave, and some of the things that were mentioned in the East-West report, talking specifically about the need for local transit services. There is demand on journeys within Kittitas and Yakima valleys. One thing that they found that there was, when they factored in a route to Yakima between Seattle and just Yakima, they found that there wasn't going to be a whole lot of demand in that direction. If they extended that route, even not going all the way, but just extending it to Toppenish and having a couple trains a day between Toppenish and Yakima, the ridership exploded. And then going on further to the Tri-Cities, it was doing even better. So what they were showing was that there is interest in a corridor within the valley, that there are need for non-auto transportation alternatives within the valley. And so what this is something actually that our former president, Lauren Herrickstead, brought up. Are you familiar with the SMART train in Marin and Sonoma counties in California? Yeah. So what we're kind of stumbling upon is that there's a really good potential where if we were to do a service like that, where we factor in, we make the most of existing rail infrastructure, make a few upgrades to it, operate a small but comfortable, well-appointed train service that serves local commuters and travelers in the area, features accommodations for bicycling, features improvements to existing trail networks, for both pedestrians and cyclists and active transportation. And you make a regional corridor that operates frequently enough that you can use it as a daily service. You can use it on your trips. Why can't we factor that in? Why can't we kind of synthesize that with the longer distance Seattle to Spokane service or long distance Amtrak Cascades trains? But there needs to be some sort of way that when we're talking about how we're creating these services, that we synthesize them together to show that there's going to be a lot more, there's a justification for a larger public investment in these, up to and including something similar to what Virginia has done with buying the rails. Because as long as we have to work, as long as we're having some competing interests with the freight railroads and we're not figuring out how to synthesize them together, as long as there's, an incentive to, for the freight railroads either not to work with us, which at least is not as much the case with BNSF. BNSF is at least a little bit friendlier, or at least in the, even with BNSF, there would still be an incentive for the public sector to overpay, because they'd have to pay for each train rather than being able to operate it at cost or less or whatnot. That makes for a challenging circumstance.
And going back to the slide you had about the new trains that Amtrak is going to be acquiring in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Is there any way, I guess, to get this route, the Stevens Pass one? Is there any way when this equipment gets put in place, they could use the last generation equipment for this?
Absolutely, and that's.
I mean, you're still doing something good for the environment in that area. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no.
Even if they just do one train a day, I don't know. Yeah.
You're still providing an option, and even with older equipment that doesn't meet the newest Tier 4 emission standards, the amount of carbon output and the amount of pollution output compared to what you get with equivalent road transportation is still significantly less.
Okay.
It's still, on the whole, significantly better, even with last generation equipment.
Okay.
And that's one reason why a lot of stuff stays in service so long.
And then my last question, and then I'll let you guys go. going back to the map you had, before that, or one of just showing the proposed. route.
Oh, just east-west,
Yeah.
okay.
So, have you guys had any discussions yet with, I guess, you had a list of all the people you wanted to talk to at Walla.
Mhm.
Well, this is shitty for saying this, but I know this will come up. I know
Uh-huh.
this will come up.
Oh, yeah.
What keeps a passenger on the train to come or bus, however, all the way to Walla Walla when they could get off anywhere from Cleellum to Pasco and visit any of the wineries there? I'm throwing that out there.
Marketing.
Well, believe
Okay,
me,
I'm throwing that out there
yeah,
because
that's,
there, I can tell you right now, some
Yeah.
of the wineries are upset, and like going back to those cruise ships,
mhm,
Yeah.
because the buses were taking them up to,
central.
Tri-Cities and to Boston.
Well, I can
And
tell,
they're not bringing them over here.
well, I'll tell you what, right now, having been to Walla Walla myself now a few times, my great aunt lives here. And I only came to Walla Walla for the first time last year. And I've been back now. This is my third time being back here. There is just something about Walla Walla. It's hard to put my finger on, but I really love coming here. And I know people here. I have family here. I have friends
And I
here.
agree with
There-
you, but I
there's-
know that this is
there's an
gonna be
interest-
something that they'll-
There's an
Well, I
interesting
think-
wine
I-
scene here.
I
Yeah.
think it's
mhm,
competition,
And-
all right?
Yeah.
mhm.
There are lots of wineries in Washington State,
mhm.
lots of them in California and
Mhm.
everywhere else.
And-
And I will say that if the Walla Walla wine people are justifiably proud of their product, which they should be.
And they are.
then
Yeah.
They.
House wine.
Understandable. I mean, they should and must come up with a way of marketing that will bring people to Walla Walla rather than process.
Mhm.
Because I can see that going two ways, just like you.
Well, and this is exactly what's happening right now in the Gulf Coast, and it's something that's made the project a little challenging there. You might be familiar with the restoration efforts of passenger rail between New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. And exactly the same thing has been going on. People in Mobile have been, have been saying, oh, well, aren't people just going to leave Mobile and go to New Orleans? Well, no. People like to get out of where they live, and people like to have options. I think no matter what, when we're connecting ourselves better, when we're giving ourselves more travel options, no matter where that is, you're providing more options and you're opening yourself. Everybody gets something out of this. I think everybody is going to win out of this. It's not just gonna make people leave Walla Walla and go to the Central Valley. Imagine how many people are gonna come here. Someone like me, I'd happily come to Walla Walla. Like I said, I have family here. I know that there's a great restaurant scene here. There's a great arts and crafts scene here that, frankly, I might not find in some of the other places. There are a lot of reasons why I would, rather come to Walla Walla or come to Walla Walla in addition to visiting anywhere else along the route. So, and I don't think Walla Walla has to be worried about competing. I think it has a lot of great things to stand up for itself. But yes, that is exactly it. Walla Walla has great things. Walla Walla needs to make that known. And by having a train that better connects Walla Walla to the rest of the state and the region, that's not going to hurt Walla Walla.
And, look, Napa Valley is not hurting because of the fact that they don't have, some of the train service.
Mhm.
I mean, Napa Valley has the cachet, to Napa Valley is Napa Valley.
I'm actually surprised, having gone to school in Napa Valley, that I think years ago, maybe it's been 12 or more years, there was a couple guys that were thinking about copying the Napa Valley wine train
Mhm.
up here.
I think it would be amazing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, there was something fairly close to it, okay?
yeah,
In the east side of Puget Sound, you could get what they call the Spirit of Washington dinner train. And it went,
Yeah.
from Renton to the winery in Woodinville, the Columbia Winery in Woodinville. And those people made a ton. That winery, their people go up there and they drink and they would buy all the bottles of wine and they make a bunch of them. And then unfortunately, the neighbors along the route didn't like the fact that there was this one train a day going through their pristine backyards, and that went away. But Columbia Winery made a ton of money there.
Mhm. So really showing that opening up accessibility to the region, to the wineries, making it easier, one less step, a few less miles for those connecting buses to have to drive in order to get people there. That's going to save the wineries money on what they've got, and it's going to bring more people. I see no reason why, really in the long run, having any sort of connecting service, even if it does, open up accessibility to competitors, is going to hurt Walla Walla.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry.
No, and I agree with that.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right.
I know that this, like I said, this discussion recently came up about these cruise ships or whatever
Yeah.
come up in Portland. It's
Mhm.
like, if they're pulling into our port, they need to be busted under wall
Mhm.
and not. But I think some of the commissioners also agreed. Again, I don't want to speak for them. They
Mhm.
also agreed as far as logistics, it would make sense because it's easier on the buses to just go into Tri-City. I don't even think they're going to Oxford, they're going into Tri-Cities.
Yeah. Mhm.
So.
See, if it were me, what I would be doing is creating a tasting room in the Tri-Cities for Walla Walla Wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a
And
regional.
I think the long-term goal is, sorry if anybody's watching from the port, the dock is just that, a dock. It's a slab of, I don't even know if it's a slab of concrete. It's just a gravel
Mhm.
block. And they want to upgrade that. There was, some of the commissioners shared that they had gone through the Mediterranean. Some of the ports are nothing more than that. Others of them have, shops and a little market, and you can go in and get local goods and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Ours, as far as Walla Walla's port in Burbank, Washington, is just a dirt lot.
Well, and there's so much more we could continue to talk about too. I would say that a big thing that we've left off the table, our organization has focused a lot on passenger rail because, there are big interests standing up for freight rail, and the ports obviously are very well connected. But I think a critically important part of this conversation as well, and something that needs to be synthesized with passenger rail conversations and discussions of potential public ownership or better public use of rail right-of-way, is intermodal freight. We know how much money we spend on highways, like you're talking about that Highway 12 restoration. So that's expensive. That costs a lot of money, and the amount of capacity that you get for that, and the amount of maintenance expenditures you get when you're doing roads, a lot of times makes it that you don't want to build it too big, because it can get easy to get to being too much of a burden on local tax revenues and on local mobility. It can, if you're too dependent on the highway and trucking network and the trucking industry, that can make it hard to get product around on time and affordably, and without causing significant public expenditures on roads and significant environmental damage. So we need to be having discussions about how can ports, including water ports and our existing highway network and the trucking industry, cooperate with rail, so that way we're using rail where it makes sense. Use all the rail infrastructure you've got and have the trucks serve the last mile destinations to improve connectivity and avoid overburdening the road system. Make the best use of the rail system for environmental reasons and for maintenance reasons altogether. And I think that's something that definitely we want the port at all of the ports across here, and particularly the ports of Walla Walla, Port of Benton, to be at the table, so that way we're having a discussion not about competing interests, but on moving things together for our residents, for our farmers, for our wineries.
And you're not going to find anyone from the cities, the counties, the port, all the different commissions, tourism, whatever. Every discussion they have, how are we doing keeping businesses open, keeping people coming in, doing this. I'm not just trying to condemn, even before the pandemic.
Yep.
Everybody is zeroed in on, as you mentioned earlier, the restaurants, the wine, and not everybody's a wine person. I'm not a wine person. I just not.
There's wine on this side, caffeine on my side.
But what I'm saying is, the discussion, everybody would be wanting, I think, to get on board with this because of the potential of what it would bring to, and it was one of your 3 E's and everything.
Mhm. Economics.
Because, yeah, that's what these communities depend on.
Absolutely.
So,
Well,
and I could just see so much potential here, you hit, like I said, I've lived here 16 years. I could name 3 reasons every one of those stops. If I were to take a train, I'd want to stop.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially.
sure. Well,
And I live in the state.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who live in this state who've never been to some of these places.
I mean,
Mhm.
there's still stuff, I gotta admit, I don't get to Seattle like I'd like to, or I should. It's just one, I don't get over.
Because it's so hard, among other reasons. Yeah.
Well, so I have one of my high school friends lives over there.
Hmm.
We lived here 16 years. I lost track when the last time we had gone over and spent more than a day just having dinner, our kids playing with their kids. And we spent a week over there. And I think it was midweek, the wife leans over and she, we have not seen you for 6 years.
Mm.
Yeah, it's been 6 years. Yes, it has. She pulled out her phone at the last time we were sitting at her dinner table.
Wow.
And I said, look, I hate driving the pass in the wintertime. Maybe I'm a little bit more paranoid than the average Joe, but it's like, I've spent the 8 hours from Cle Elum to North Bend in a winter storm.
Yeah.
I've done that.
Yeah.
And I, without children, with my kids are teenagers now, but when they were younger, we just didn't from, say, Christmas to Valentine's Day, because it seemed like it always snowed around here January, February.
Mhm.
We just didn't go out of town.
Yeah.
Understood.
Because you couldn't. It didn't
And
make
like
sense.
I said, the time that I rode Amtrak, just go, one was a funeral and one was a business meeting, rain or shine, I had to be in Portland for, I took Amtrak.
Mhm.
But for me to go to Seattle on Amtrak now, I gotta go up and around.
Yeah, and that takes forever. I have a friend of mine who lives he lives in Olympia Lacey to go to college at my alma mater, St. Martin's University.
Yeah.
But he's originally from China. He lived in the Tri-Cities for his high school years, and he still has lots of friends and his former host family there. And yeah, he talked about trying to do that and just how bad of a connection that was, how long that took trying to go Seattle to Portland to Tri-Cities. But I mean, I think you've brought up a great point. I think this is a great thing to talk about. And I think it's something we're not talking about enough of as a society. Not having good connections between rural and urban areas, crossing our sides of the mountains, between, left and right leaning communities is a bad thing for our society. It makes us more separated. It makes it easier for us to just think, oh, those people over there. And that doesn't, that's kind of wherever you are. I know that there's, a lot of misunderstanding and distrust, that's separated by the mountains. And exactly for that reason, when it's so hard to be able to visit people, when it's so hard to be able to have these experiences, it does a lot to divide our society. And I think that's a key reason why I'm so involved with this. And I know Charlie will say this too. Rail is one of the very few topics left in American society, pretty much, that is still strongly bipartisan. It's something that people support in rural communities, in small towns, in medium cities, and in our largest metro areas. People recognize that there are benefits of all sorts toward better connecting the places where we're from, the places where our families live, where there are amazing, beautiful things to do and see. And we have this incredible region in the Pacific Northwest that I'm so proud to call home. I have friends and family all across the region that I love to be able to see and to hang out with more and to have a toast to this wonderful place that we have. But when it's so hard to get around, it makes it hard to see people. It's easy to go 4, 5, 6 years without seeing people that or going to the places that you really want to go just because of how hard it is. My grandparents, living in the Puget Sound area, talk about how much they want to go see more of their family, but it's hard to do so because you try to get onto I-5 and it's terrifying. It's unsafe. As we have a demographic crisis, we have more and more people getting older. My great aunt, her husband just passed away. She's in her early 90s now. And to expect her to be able to drive to go visit my grandma and who is now, she was the youngest of the sisters. She's, now in her early 80s. That does a lot to split families. That does a lot to make it hard for people to get around. And that's really what I got into All Aboard for. Yeah, I had this amazing opportunity to study abroad in Japan for a semester. And I was able to get across the entire country without having to own a car and without having to hop on an airplane. I was able to walk places, bike places, take a bus, take a train across the entire country. And that opened up so much of Japan to me. And that's one thing that helped me fall in love with Japan as a place, was being able to experience it as a person and not dependent on a car, not dependent on the highways. And that's what I think it's really all about here, is that whether it's East, West, urban, rural, Democrat or Republican, if we can better connect ourselves to each other, we can understand each other better. We can have more family and friend get-togethers. We can experience the great wine or the great coffee. We can make it easier to get to, good regional medical care facilities. We can go to sports events. We can do more to unite ourselves as a society in a time where we're so divided. I think if there's anything to leave us off with at this, it's that East-West Passenger Rail is not just about trains. It's about better connecting Washington. It's about better connecting the Northwest. It's about, trying to ease these divisions that we're facing, that these mountains do a good job of creating. But I don't think it's impossible to relieve them. I think it's better that it's easier than we think to reduce some of these divisions as a society, to better connect rural and urban America, and to bring us together as a country again. We just have to be committed to making those short-term prudent steps, spending our money in the right places, making sure that we're including everybody. Equity isn't just about, racial or socioeconomic equity. It's about geographic equity. It's about, rural versus urban equity. So that's why we care about this project so much. And that's why we think it has a lot to offer, not just for the cities that it serves, but any of the cities that could be connected by better bus service to it.
Well, thank you very much. I've learned a lot, and I wish everybody well.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for taking the
much.
time to answer some of my questions.
And thank you for taking the time to come out here and have this conversation, because I think it's more relevant than ever. And we're really glad that you gave us some support and press in Pendleton. Like I said, one of my best friends lived there. So I know that there's a lot in it for us on both sides of the Columbia River. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with this, and we'd love to stay in touch with you. If you have any questions, if there's anything else you want to talk about, we're happy to talk with you. We can refer you to our friends in Oregon as well, who are working on the Portland to Boise project and beyond. And yeah, we'll definitely keep in touch.
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.